Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. We are going to move quickly because I know we were in a race against the weather, but that's not going to stop us from having a great time. Thank you so much for being here. We're here because we know that we're at a moment in American history that comes along once in a while, I'd say once or twice in a lifetime, where the choices we make in the next 3 or 4 years decide what's going to happen in the next 30 or 40. And we have a responsibility to rise to that moment by acting according to our values, by organizing a politics that's not about just what's going to happen in the next political moment or who's going to look good on cable or what's happening in the Washington show, but that our values are at stake. And as we do that, we also have an opportunity to change the conversation about what values mean in American politics. I need your help to put an end to the idea that freedom, security, and democracy are values that belong to one political party. Because things like freedom are not conservative values, they are American values, and we got to stand up for them.
Yes.
We know that you're not free if you don't have health care. Health care is part of freedom, just as much as cutting some unnecessary regulation. We know that you're not free if you're making $7.25 an hour and you're not able to build a living out of that, let alone raise a family. That's freedom at stake.
Correct.
You're not free as a woman if your reproductive health care decisions are being dictated by male politicians. And you're certainly not free if a county clerk gets to tell you who you ought to marry based on their interpretation of their religion. We know that freedom comes by way of organization. Freedom comes by way of education, which is why we honor our teachers and why the next president ought to put in a Secretary of Education who actually believes in public education. And we know that every American is less free so long as we live in a country where racial inequalities persist, not just in criminal justice, but in economics, housing, home ownership, and health. We are all less free when those racial inequalities persist. It's why we put forward a plan as ambitious as the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. We need a Douglas Plan to help rebuild Black America and make things right. Goes to everything from how the federal government does business with minority-owned enterprises to making sure our criminal justice system is actually an instrument of justice rather than injustice.
Yeah.
We're living through this right now in South Bend, where our whole community is grieving in the wake of a police shooting that claimed the life of a black man in our city. And while the facts are still coming in what happened, one of the reasons why we are all in so much pain is not just the anguish of a family, but it's the anguish of a community that knows what is at stake in policing, that knows the burden that lies over every community due to the fact that through our history, many of the worst moments in racial injustice in this country were served up at the hands of law enforcement, something that burdens every person of color and every police officer to this day. I want to live in a country where a black person and a white person feels the exact same thing when they see a police vehicle approaching, and that thing they feel is safety. We got to work toward that together in the name of our values. And patriotism is another value that we have to insist is American, not Republican.
Yes.
The tall trees and the red soil around here are familiar to me because I first encountered them when I came to South Carolina on an extended stay courtesy of Uncle Sam doing combat training before going to Afghanistan. All right, we got a few veterans. How many veterans we got here? Thank you for serving. I think veterans recognize what's at stake in national security, and we also know that there's a lot more to security than things you can deal with just by putting up a wall from one coast to the other. That's not going to help us with cybersecurity or election security. It's not going to help us deal with the security challenges posed by something like violent white nationalism that has claimed lives from Charleston, South Carolina to San Diego, California. That's national security. And climate disruption is a national security issue and deserves the resources that go into keeping us safe. Now let's talk about democracy. Because in America, we like to believe that we are a democratic country. But we're not a democracy if districts are drawn where politicians get to choose their voters instead of the other way around. We're not a democracy if dollars can outvote people because we lack real campaign finance law. And I think in a democracy, we ought to see to it that voters from South Carolina to Indiana are heard, whether our state is deep red, like ours, or blue, by simply arranging our presidential elections so that we give the presidency to the person who got the most votes across this country. That's what democracies do. And of course, we know that the undemocratic tendencies that we have been seeing in recent years are often racially motivated and motivated by partisan reasons. Where I would say if your party decides that more voters voting means you're going to lose, that's when it's time to come up with some new policies, not suppress the vote. Now, in just a few days, you're going to see a couple dozen Democrats over the course of 2 nights debating. And it's going to be great. We can't wait. I'm starting to practice. Get ready. We're not having somebody play all 9 of the others. It'd be too complicated. But what you're going to see is that we all share pretty common and similar values in the Democratic Party. I think the question on so many voters' minds is, how are we going to win? We cannot take 4 more years of this presidency. No. So we've got to win. There's no options. And here's how we do it. First of all, we remember that most Americans are with us on the issues. They're with us on raising wages. They're with us on protecting health care. They're with us on education. They're with us on immigration. They're with us on guns. Whether you hear that or not in the media, it's true. 90% of Americans think we ought to do universal background checks, and Congress can't get it done. So the only way we can't win is if we're not talking about these issues and how they affect you. We can't win if we're talking about him. Because if we're talking about him, we're not talking about you. And so we're not going to try to go on his show, his game show, or reality show, or horror show, or whatever we're going to call it. You don't go on his show. What we're going to do is we're going to pick up the remote and change the channel completely. Feeling a couple little drops, and I don't want to be talking at you the whole time we have together, so let's take advantage of our time and have a bit of a conversation. We've got some questions, I think, gathered up here, and please welcome our Democratic leader and moderator for the day. How you doing? In uniform, I see, too. Awesome. Look at this well-dressed gentleman. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mayor Pete. All right, so we'll take a few questions. First question, what's your plan for stopping climate change? What part does overpopulation have on climate change?
Thank you. And is our questioner here? Somebody remember writing that question? We get a name on there? Or,
Question from Greg.
Greg here? Oh, there you are. What? Oh, all the way back there. Oh, thank you for your question. Like I said, climate change is a national security imperative. We've got to act. And what we know is we got to have carbon pricing, but we can do it in a way that it is rebated out to the American people, and we do it in a progressive way so most people are made economically better off than before. We know we got to invest in renewables. And we got to invest in carbon storage and energy storage. And here's something no one's talking about. We got to invest in rural America as part of the solution on climate instead of just telling them they're part of the problem. Some researchers believe that you can take the soil, it's scientifically shown that the soil in this country and around the world has enough ability to store carbon that it would be the same as all the carbon that's put out by the entire global transportation sector, if we can figure out the technology to do it. So to me, that sounds like a pretty good use of federal R&D dollars. So we're going to do that. We're going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, which we never should have pulled out. And then because we know so many of the solutions are at the local and state level, cities coming together to be more sustainable, we're going to follow it up with a Pittsburgh Climate Summit where the federal government promises to support states and cities in the good work that they already have underway.
Yes.
All right, our next question. What was your biggest surprise about your job as mayor when you took office? And what do you think your biggest surprise would be as president?
Good question. Who asked that one?
This is a question from Susan.
Susan, you here? Hi, Susan. Well, the biggest immediate surprise was a snowstorm. So when you're a mayor, where I come from, snow is a really important part of your job, at least in the wintertime. I know it's a little different here. For us, if it's less than a foot, people expect it to be cleared up to where you can get to work. And so we had one the day I got sworn in. But then I learned a lot about plowing snow, and of course we got taken care of. So that was a surprise. The other big surprise is just the number of things you get asked about. The number of things that wind up on your plate. Things you plan on for months, and things that hit you out of the blue. That you have to figure out how to respond to. Not just technically, not just in terms of policy, but morally. When you have a no-win situation, or a moment where people are being divided against each other, how do you summon a community to feel better and to rise to their highest values? It could be something that happens half a world away. When the New Zealand shooting happened, that horrible shooting that targeted so many Muslim worshippers there, we had outreach from the Islamic Center in our community, the mosque that serves people in South Bend, about how fearful they were having seen that happen. It was Friday, it's their day of prayer. It's the day they were coming together to pray. And I realized, this is nowhere in the handbook on how to be a mayor, but I realized part of my job was to let them know that the city stood with them, that they were going to be kept safe, and that they belonged in our community just as much as anyone else. So, there's going to be no shortage of surprises confronting the next president. Hopefully a few of them are in the form of good news, but usually the good news isn't what goes to the president's desk for a decision. But that's why it matters so much, especially when impossible situations come up, where there's no easy answer or right answer. That we have a president who's in touch with the values that motivate us as a country. And that's what this campaign is about.
All right, our next question is from Ashley from Georgia Southern University.
All right. Ashley. All right.
Ashley's question is, what is your advice to young people trying to advocate for social change in the current climate?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you for being engaged and involved. I'll try not to give the self-serving advice, which is to become part of our campaign and be active there, but I do hope you'll do that. But if you think about it, major positive social change almost never comes about without young people rising up and being part of it. You don't even have to be old enough to vote to make a difference. I've seen votes go differently in city council meetings because a few high school students came and said, you ought to do it this way and not that way. But also major moments of progress in the life of this country, like the civil rights movement, so much of which was students being organized. And what excites me about this moment, what excites me about this crowd, is the chance for an intergenerational alliance. Young people, yes, but also people, our parents and grandparents' age, at our side cheering us on to get this done. And I see that potential in the moment that we're in. The last thing I would mention is that nothing has more of a moral effect, I think, on a leader than a young person asking an urgent question or demanding change. A 12-year-old, a few days ago at an event, asked me what we were doing about gun violence and what we were doing to keep schools safe. And while that question has always been on my mind, just as somebody who was in high school when Columbine happened, when you have a child ask you that question, the thing that you think about, of course, is how do I not let this person down? And when we have young adults, students, and young Democrats rising to call this nation to account for the question of whether we will succeed or fail to deal with climate change, which in our lifetimes is going to be make or break for our chances. Whether we will succeed or fail to have a fair economic policy, knowing the trillion-dollar holes blown in the budget for tax cuts for rich people will create bills that will come due in our lifetimes. That we have reached such a point of racial inequality in this nation that, in my view, it will either be solved in our lifetime or it will tear apart the American project in our lifetime. That each of these issues has a special urgency when young people are demanding change. And so my best advice is to stay involved, to rise up, to find friends, and this is a lesson I'll say, to engage people you know. Because it's one thing to respond to a campaign, asking to get somebody's attention. It's another thing to respond to your friend. The most powerful thing that can get somebody off the bench and involved is for somebody they already know to say, hey, come with me to this event. Come join this, sign this petition with me. Be part of this action with me. Come see Mayor Pete speak with me. Look at that, all right. So you're ahead of the curve. It's the most powerful thing, and so much in this country's future depends on whether enough young people reach out to their friends and say, come vote with me on election day.
I have over 20.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Peter. Peter's
Good name.
Peter's question is, what will be your foreign policy towards Iran, and how would you de-escalate the current situation without war?
Thank you. Where's Peter? Thank you for your question. You know, when I left Afghanistan 5 years ago, I thought I was one of the very last troops turning out the lights. And it's been 5 years and we're still there. I'm afraid we're not that far from getting the first headline about someone lost in Afghanistan, an American, who was not born when 9/11 happened, unless we can figure out a way to put an end to endless war. And what that taught me is just how hard it is to end a conflict, especially a conflict in that part of the country, once you've stepped in. And that's why I'm so disturbed by what appears to be an escalation toward war with Iran, engineered, by the way, by some of the very same people who got us into the war in Iraq. The person running the Situation Room for this president is one of the people who got us into Iraq. A president who pretends he was against the Iraq war all along, even though we know that's untrue. And that's why it's so important that, first of all, Congress step up and assert its war powers. Because Congress has been asleep at the switch, but in this country, Congress decides when we go to war. But it's also important that we have a president who understands the stakes. The idea that the president launched basically a war and then changed his mind at the last minute, I guess I'm glad he changed his mind, but what does this mean? It means we have a president who is easy to manipulate, who has trouble making decisions, who does not have a defense secretary, and who's taken advice from one of the people who engineered the worst foreign policy blunder in my lifetime. The solution lies with American allies, our alliances, our relationships, what's left of them, to pull together everybody who has an interest in peace in that region, which, by the way, is everybody, and make sure we come back from the brink. Not that Iran has been a good actor by any means, but that we isolate the kind of provocative behavior that they have displayed with our allies at our side, instead of poking them in the eye over fights that we don't need. That's the way to peace, and that's the way to strength, in my view.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from Mickey, and Mickey's question is, how do we return DC to following laws and not being above the law?
Where's Mickey? Thank you. One of the basic ideas of this country is that we are all equal before the law. Our country rests on this principle. And that's true for you and me, and it's true for the president, and it's true for anyone in our society. Of course, we know it's not fully been experienced that way. We know that in terms of racial disparities in the criminal justice system. And we know that that is not a principle respected by this president, because he doesn't seem to think the laws apply to him. Now, the next president is going to have to establish a Department of Justice that can think for itself, that is independent, that that is not a private law firm benefiting the president's personal agenda, but serves the American people first. And as part of their work, I expect that they will probably have quite a bit of homework to do, dealing with things that have taken place during these 4 years. And I expect them to do their job independently from any political pressure, from any direction, and render justice for anybody who has transgressed the law.
Our next question doesn't have a name on it, but the question is, as the primary becomes more divisive, how do you intend to quell criticism from the far left in order to win over supporters of other candidates in the general?
So, I do think everybody's on their best behavior now. Everybody's getting along great. I mean, we really do like each other among the competitors. You should know this. We're seeing each other more and more, especially as we're parading through places like South Carolina. We like each other, but you know, our supporters are passionate, and there's going to be moments when this takes on an edge, especially as it comes to a smaller number of people. And it's okay to talk about the contrasts in our views. I'm prepared to talk to people who want to pull our party further to the right than I think makes sense, why we got to stand on our values. And I'm also prepared to share with people who want us to go further why I'm working so hard never to make a promise we can't keep. Yes, I want college to be free someday for everybody, but my focus is on making it free for low-income people first. And if we can't afford just yet to make it free for the child of a billionaire, that's okay as long as we make sure low-income people don't see costs to bear. So let's have those debates. Those debates are healthy. But we got to remember, at the end of the day, what we're up against. This is not just the wolf at the gates, all right? The wolf got through the gates and is eating our chickens, and we got to come together as a party. And that means that 22 people who don't wind up as the nominee need to support the one who does, no matter who it is, and work together for victory.
This question is from Fred, and Fred asked, why have no Democratic candidates spoke out about the corporate socialism the Republicans support?
It's a great way to put it. Fred here? I don't see Fred. Oh, way in the back. Hi, Fred. Thank you. It's a great point. You know, one definition of conservatives is that they prefer socialism for those who are already well off, and then capitalism for the rest of us. They never put it in those terms, but think about some of the giveaways. I mean, just this latest tax break, for example. You know, some of the folks on Fox, after I said that the tax cut went to benefit the wealthiest, they said, "Well, that's not true. It went to benefit corporations." Okay. Who do you think owns most of the corporations? But the broader point here is that there has been a thumb on the scale in our economy. There is a relationship between economic power and political power right now. And we have to break that relationship, or we will wind up in a situation that amounts to capitalism without democracy. And democracy makes all the difference in the world. It's like all this talk about socialism, most of which is just rhetoric. But they're trying to scare us, right? They say if we let everybody have health care, we're going to wind up like Venezuela. Well, what's the real difference between socialism in a place like Venezuela and socialism in a place like Denmark? The difference is democracy. It makes all the difference in the world. And that's true in capitalism, too. The difference is democracy. And so we've got to protect our democracy. It's why we need to get money out of politics. It's why we need to insist on fairness. And the fundamental premise here is that you can't have a functioning capitalist system if some players are able to rewrite the rules, which is exactly what's happening in Washington, and why, for my time, it might make sense to send somebody to Washington who's not a creature of Washington to get it to work more like our best-run cities and towns rather than the other way around.
This question doesn't have a name either, but the question is, what should be done about student loan debt?
So this one's a little personal because Chasten and I have, as a household, have six-figure student debt ourselves. Mostly because he decided to become a teacher. Real selfish, right? Become a teacher. And so many people do the right thing and wind up with enormous college debt. So here are a few ideas. One, if you can refinance a mortgage on your house, why can't you refinance the interest rates on your debt? There's another thing, which is, under the Obama administration, for-profit colleges that got people to sign up for programs that did not deliver value were held accountable. This administration got rid of those rules. I think we should not only bring back those rules, but we should be ready to erase the debt of people who were taken in by those for-profit colleges and watch them basically turn the Department of Education into America's biggest predatory lender. It's not right, and we should do something about it. Now, we also got to make college more affordable on the front end. That means working with states to bring down the share of tuition that students pay. It means that we got to expand Pell Grants, and this time let's actually peg it to inflation so you don't have to go to Congress every time Pell Grants start losing their value. We have to do that. And if we do it right, we can make college debt-free, at least for low and middle income students. There's one other thing I want to mention that doesn't come up as much in this debate. It is definitely too expensive to go to college in this country. It's also too expensive to not go to college in this country. You ought to be able to make a decent living, to afford to raise a family, and be just a little generous in your community, your church, and your Little League, whether you went to college or not. And that is one of the many reasons why we need living wages in this country as the law of the land.
This question is from Caroline. Caroline says, what are your thoughts on restrictions to online speech?
Is Caroline here? Oh, there you are. Hi. Thanks for being here. So, every freedom has common sense attached to it. And that's one of the things we got to recognize when it comes to hate speech that is provoking violence, or misinformation and fake videos, these things that are going to be more and more of a problem in our lifetime. And part of what's happening in a bigger picture sense is you've got tech companies making what amount to policy decisions because the policy environment's let them down. I don't think these tech companies should, or perhaps even want to, be making some of these decisions. But we haven't set up the right kind of framework in our legal system. And you can see why. You know, you watch a tech executive brought before a congressional committee, and the questions make it abundantly clear that the elected officials have no idea what it is they're regulating. So we need a smart, informed policy, not only on how misinformation moves around social media and the difference between claiming that you're a neutral platform and amounting to a publisher or an editor of this stuff, but also rules around data privacy, data security, and how our data is sold and monetized in a bigger market. We ought to have one national framework for that, not 50.
Next question is from Brian. Brian says, please tell us about your long-term energy policy, particularly the risk of nuclear and carbon emission reduction.
Thank you. What was the questioner's name? Brian. Right here. Hey, thanks for coming. So we need to move toward clean energy in this country. That's the first and the clearest thing. And if we have the right kind of carbon pricing, that will help speed that along. But we also need investments at the federal level in order to support that. I think our first priority has to be moving away from carbon. Anything that emits carbon is contributing directly to a national emergency. The longer term, we need to move to 100% clean energy, which means that we've got to move on from nuclear in an age when we don't have a way to store that waste. But the first priority's got to be carbon. And if we get this right, we can also make this empowering for families. So part of what I'd like to see us do, and we're close, we're not there, but we're close with things like solar. In South Bend right now, we're partnering with Habitat for Humanity to build net zero energy homes with solar. And South Bend is not the sunniest place in the world, so if we can do it, we know we're close. It takes a subsidy, but eventually we can get there. And the reason that matters is because energy independence is not only something we should strive for as a country, I think it's something we should deliver to American households. Imagine the difference between saying, okay, America's energy independent and saying, you're going to be energy independent. Think about the financial empowerment that comes with not paying a utility bill. We can move in that direction if we invest properly in not only creating energy, but storing, which is where a lot of the real gains are to be made, actually. It's things like battery technology that help us store up the energy that we gather from sources that are intermittent. And if we get that right, it will be a huge part of the solution on climate. Thanks for this.
Our next question says, what is your position on the concept of cash bail in the bail bond industry?
Is there a questioner here? That's you. Thank you for bringing that up, because I think we're finally in a moment where people are seeing that we can't keep doing what we're doing. Oh, wonderful. Well, thanks for that. If you didn't hear, she's a public defender. How's that for a career choice? Thank you. I just don't want to live in a society where people profit off misery. And we see that in the bail bonds industry. We see how cash bail leads to so many people being incarcerated at great public expense, as well as at huge cost to their families, while awaiting trial, before the justice system has rendered any kind of decision on whether they ought to be denied freedom. And so we've got to reform that. And speaking of profiting from misery, we are going to have a very hard time dealing with the crisis of being the most incarcerated developed country until we do away with an industry that has a financial stake in more people being incarcerated. Woo!
This next question is from Ray. Ray says, I'm a primary care provider that is sincerely interested in universal health care for all Americans. I, like many of my colleagues, am less than enthusiastic about Medicare for all. All the medicines won't fit on the card, but one, how do we pay for it? And number two, how do we fix the already cumbersome and overregulated system that is driving providers away now?
It's right here. Hello. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your work. And thank you for raising that, because I think any elected or candidate who allows the phrase Medicare for all to escape their lips needs to talk about the practicalities of this. And it's one of the reasons why, although I do believe passionately in universal health care, I also believe we don't just promise we can flip a switch and make it happen. That the way we do it is through something that I would call Medicare for all who want it, that allows people to buy in to a Medicare-like option, and then provide the proof of concept that it would be not only more inclusive, but more effective than the corporate options that are out there. And in so doing, become a very natural glide path as people buy into it, to replace the corporate options and move us to a universal environment. But as your question, thanks for fitting it onto that card, because I know there's a lot behind this. But as you raised, that doesn't in its own guarantee that we're going to get there. We spend way too much of our healthcare dollar in this country, not on patient care, not on what you do, but on bureaucracy, on administrativity, or even forcing you with all of your specialized medical skills to spend time dealing with administrativity instead of dealing with patients. And we've got to fix that. And while I do believe the purchasing power of Medicare can help with the cost issue as we expand it, it's also clear that we got a lot of work to do under the hood. It is not glamorous stuff. It's not the stuff of rallies. I've never seen somebody get people fired up at a rally saying, fewer human interactions on prior authorization paperwork processing or bust, right? All right, maybe some folks here. But think about it. We have automated away the inefficiencies in so many parts of our economy and automated away a lot of jobs while we were at it. But in healthcare, there are still far too many twists and turns that a simple interaction has to go through in order to get something done. And Medicare can either be part of the solution or it can be part of the problem. But if we have the right kind of emphasis on making sure that it is an efficient system, not just an inclusive one, but an efficient one, with the input from the medical community, then I believe we can deliver a Medicare and medical environment where much more of that patient dollar does go into what matters most. And when we do that, we will also see more of that dollar available to reverse the trend of rural providers closing up shop and being unable to maintain their operations. So thank you.
This question is from Reed. Question is, what is your view on universal income?
Right here? All right. Oh, where'd you go? All right. Yeah. So You know, there have been proposals over the years on how to do this, how to make sure that there is an income floor, or some people have talked about a negative income tax. I'm interested in things that build on what we have in terms of like the earned income tax credit. By the way, earned income tax credit, great policy with a terrible name, because most people don't even know what it does. But it is one of the most effective anti-poverty measures we've ever had. I believe we need to explore an income floor for working people. But I also think we need to expand our understanding of work, what work is, to include domestic work, to include caregiving, to include parenting, to include studying, and that should be a factor when we contemplate it. So I'm not prepared to embrace the kind of check in the mail for everybody model, although I'm interested to see what some of the experiments underway. You know, they're trying this out in Stockton, California. My friend, the mayor there, Michael Tubbs, is overseeing an experiment. I want to see what it leads to. Because no question that we need to get more cash in more people's pockets. But I want to make sure that we don't do anything on that end that would be a pass on the fact that our economy is structured unfairly. That you shouldn't be working and be poor. It should be impossible. It should be impossible. And we've got to fix that too.
And this is our last question. Question is, what is your position on charter schools and the movement towards for-profit educational institutions and how it affects IDEA?
How it affects what?
IDEA.
You know, the law.
IDEA.
Oh, with the
Yeah.
disabilities. Yeah.
I
Oh,
know
thank you.
what that is.
First of all, as you know, we have not properly funded or enforced IDEA, and that is, you know, if we want to be serious about supporting people, and disabled students deserve that kind of support. So we've got to step up and do that. And as your question insightfully pointed out, the trend toward for-profit charters is not helping. It's one of many reasons I think we have to stop the expansion of for-profit charters.
There you go.
Remember, the promise behind charters was that ideas would be pioneered there that could then be applied for the benefit of all. That's the idea. So if we're going to have that be part of our system, it can't be at the expense of the public education system. It has to be to reinforce it. And I'm married to teachers, so I get an education about education every day I come home. And I can tell you that we, as a country, have a decision to make about whether we will invest properly in quality public education for everybody or not. And if we don't, it will reinforce the inequalities that are putting such a strain on American life and holding so many people back from the American dream. If we keep disinvesting in education, we will pay a terrible price in everything from national unity to national security. We have got to be ready to invest. I guess that's our last question. Thank you once again for moderating. And thanks all of you for being here. It means a lot. I'm so excited about the road ahead. We cannot win without